Well, hello, and thank you for stopping by to go over our Chapter 3 Image Formation and Radiographic Quality PowerPoint. This will be a lot of review, but hopefully it will sort of continue to solidify some of the things we've been talking about. So let's go ahead and get started. Our objectives for today, I'll let you go ahead and read over those, and hopefully each of these items are going to trigger things that you already know. So take a look at those. Okay, and here we get started. So we have been over extensively how we get to our photon production. And so when we talk about how we get an image, I'm going to pick up right from where the anode interacts with those incoming electrons or the tube current, and it's going to produce our photons coming down to our patient. Now, it's pretty simplified once we get through here, but we have our incident photons coming through. They're going to interact with the patient. Some of those photons are going to breeze right through and be transmitted, creating what we call the remnant beam, or the beam that's going to contribute to the latent image or the image. Others are going to interact with different molecules or atoms within the body, and when that happens, they can either be absorbed through photoelectric interactions, or they can be scattered through our Compton. Those that scatter through our Compton often contribute to our remnant beam as well. And if either of the transmitted beam or the Compton scatter reaches the image receptor, there's a probability that it may or may not interact with the imaging plate. So some of our photons that reach the image receptor can actually breeze right through. And we have that especially in image receptors that have low DQE, or detective quantum efficiency. Those that do interact with the elements within the image receptor are going to create a signal. The more numbers, the higher the signal. So the more numbers that interact with a certain pixel or crystal or whatever it is we're using in that imaging plate is going to create a density, and that density is really produced as an electrical signal in our digital imaging. And therefore, we're able to get our image because we have densities where there's transmission. So low attenuating anatomy is going to be demonstrating densities posterior to it, whereas our highly attenuating anatomy is going to absorb the photons, leaving a lack of density or brightness, which will also contribute to the image. So we need those photoelectric and the transmitted photons in order to create the images that we know that we look at today. So the image formation as we know it is completely reliant upon the beam itself, the beam's energy, as well as differential absorption within the anatomy. So our higher atomic number atoms in our body are going to absorb more, whereas our lower atomic number atoms are going to allow more transmission. In addition to that, the thicker the body part, the probability of those interactions are going to increase. So the thicker the body, the more absorption we're going to have and the less transmission. In addition, the density of the body part is going to increase the probability of interactions at that atomic level as well. So with increased thickness, higher atomic number, and increased tissue density, you're going to have more photoelectric interactions and therefore more absorption. When we decrease our thickness, our atomic number, and our tissue density, we're going to have a greater probability of more transmission. And we see that when we look at bone versus muscle or air. Bone has a much higher atomic number because of the calcium and the other atoms it's made out of. And then it's also going to have a higher tissue density because those atoms are more tightly compact. And so the probability of interactions are going to be much higher with those tightly packed tissues. So and that's why we see our bone is going to be bright because it is demonstrating higher attenuation, whereas air is going to be much more radiolucent because the atomic number of the particles in air is much lower, and then the density of those air molecules is much lower. We also know that the wavelength of electromagnetic radiation, specifically our X-ray photons, is going to determine what size of matter they interact with. So because they're high energy, they have very short wavelengths, and those short wavelengths are going to therefore interact with very small particles. So our lower energy low energy photons will interact with our atoms as a whole. It will excite the atom, whereas our moderate energy photons are going to be more likely to interact with the electrons in the atom. And then the highest energy photons, which really is out of the scope of general radiography, those would interact with the nuclei of an atom. So when we have a really low energy photon to the left of our spectrum, those are going to be more likely to interact with those skin molecules, excite the molecules, lose all their energy there, and therefore be absorbed and contribute to the skin dose. Whereas I mentioned the moderate energy electrons towards the middle of our spectrum are going to be more likely to be able to dislodge those electrons, causing a photoelectric interaction, or excite the outer shell electrons, causing Compton scatter. So that's what we're working in. That's what's contributing to our image the most. And then the higher energy photons interacting with the nuclei is really going to really only come into play in very high energy applications that really we just don't use in radiography. The term attenuation means any reduction in the beam's intensity. So anytime that I have a photoelectric interaction inside the human body, we know that that energy is basically transferred from the incoming photon to this ejected electron, and that incoming photon then is going to lose all of its energy there. Therefore, there is no photon available to continue. That would mean that my photon here was attenuated. Now, if I had another interaction, say a scattering interaction here, where my photon then missed the image receptor, we would also call that attenuation because it did not contribute to the image. So anytime we have an overall intensity reduction, we're having attenuation. Now, sometimes a scatter event may go ahead and reach the image receptor. In that case, it would still contribute to the intensity, and it would therefore not be attenuated. All right, now differential absorption. If we look back to last semester, we talked a lot about subject contrast. Subject contrast means the difference in attenuating properties of different anatomical structures. So here you would see that the subject contrast between the spine and, let's say, lungs would be very high. They would have significantly different attenuating properties. So that would be subject contrast would be specific to the body part that we're imaging. Okay, so that subject contrast is going to have a significant impact on our differential absorption. As the primary X-ray beam, like it says here, interacts with the anatomic part, our photons are going to be absorbed, scattered, or transmitted. Now, depending on the subject contrast of that anatomic part will determine how much is absorbed, how much is scattered, and how much is transmitted. So, as I said, the subject contrast, the higher the subject contrast, the more you're going to typically see radiographic contrast as well. So how does this happen? So when we create our X-ray beam, during absorption, the energy of the primary beam is deposited within the atoms comprising the tissue. So I would have, as you see here, an incident beam come in. It ejects this inner shell electron and therefore loses all of its energy. Now, because of that, I would no longer have a photon. This would be a completely attenuated or absorbed photon. That would be referred to as our photoelectric interaction. The X-ray ionizes the atom by ejecting the K shell electron. Low energy secondary X-ray photons, or photoelectrons in that case, are then created. So similar to our characteristic interactions in the tube, when we have a vacant inner shell electron, we're going to have outer shell electrons jump down and fulfill that inner shell electron. When it does that, it is going to produce a secondary photon called a photoelectron, But typically these photoelectrons are such low energy electrons that they then go get absorbed in a nearby atom. So we don't pay a lot of attention to that. We know that those are produced, but we don't necessarily put a lot of stock in that. When this occurs, then our molecule is left ionized. However, there's often an electron floating around in tissue that will then come in, fulfill those vacancies, and then gets the atom back to neutral. But because the molecule is left ionized for a short period of time, that's when we really have to worry about our radiobiologic effects. Now, the probability of a photoelectric interaction depends on the energy of the beam, or the energy of the incoming or incident photon, and the tissue's atomic number. So we know that these K-shell electrons can never be emitted if our incoming beam does not have a greater energy than the binding energy of that K-shell electron. So that's why when we have that X-ray spectrum, those energies on the left of our spectrum over here oftentimes are not going to have enough energy to eject that K-shell electron. Therefore, they're going to be incapable of producing a photoelectric interaction. So this is also going to be dependent on the atom's atomic number. So say we have a calcium atom in bone. Well, that's going to have a higher atomic number, therefore a higher binding energy, and therefore it would take more energy of an incoming photon to eject that inner shell electron. Now, if I have something with a much lower atomic number, the binding energy will be less, and that will shift what photoelectric interactions can occur more to the left. Okay, scattering occurs, we call it Compton scattering, when we have an incident photon coming in. It doesn't necessarily interact with our K-shell electron, but it is able to interact with an outer shell electron, and it can eject one of those low binding energy outer shell electrons, and when it does that, it has a slight reduction in its own energy. However, if it has a higher energy than the binding energy of that outer shell electron, then it will continue to exist, but it will change its direction, and that's what creates the scattering event. Now again, at this point, our atom would be ionized, and we'd have a free-floating ion, or this electron, out in our tissue. Now that electron can go be scooped up by another atom, getting it that's also ionized, getting it back to a neutral state. Now, just because one scattering event occurred doesn't mean that that scattered electron is going to continue on and go interact with the image receptor. If it has enough energy, it can go on to have many more Compton interactions, and depending on its ultimate direction of transmission, it will actually, it may or may not hit the image receptor, contributing to the remnant beam or the image. Okay, absorption versus scattering. So tissue and atom composition are more important in absorption or photoelectric interaction. So you can see here on our left, we have photoelectric effect occurs. That incident photon interacts with the K shell or lower shell electron. It has enough energy that's able to eject that. When it ejects that, we know that we'll have this cascading event of electrons coming in to fulfill that vacancy, ultimately leaving their shells vacant. Now that cascading event will emit very low level photons, which will be absorbed up into typically a neighboring atom. The ejected electron, called the photoelectron, imparts the atom with equal energy to the excess of the electron's binding energy. So if my binding energy of this particular atom was, for example, let's say 50, then if my incoming photon had 100 keV of energy, that electron would exit with the 50 keV that was left over after the ejection process that utilized 50 keV just to overcome the binding energy. So photon comes in, crashes into this electron. It takes 50 keV just to get it out of its shell. Then the electron travels with the other available 50 keV. All right, and like I said, then that triggers the cascading event. Ultimately, the atom will then be ionized until a neighboring electron falls in to bring it back to its neutral state. Now, Compton photon interacts with an outer shell electron. It imparts only some of its energy. That electron gets emitted. The remaining energy is left to the photon as it proceeds to continue in a new direction. And here's just a quick little chart that helps you sort of differentiate the Compton and the photoelectric interactions. Okay, so one of the useful ways, one of a good study technique if you're having any issues with this is to start doing some concept mapping. And I know we've worked on this a little bit in the past, but one of the ways you can do it is to start with when I have a high KVP, that's going to increase my overall energy beam. It's going to shift my spectrum to the right. That will mean I have more energy in my incoming photons to create more photoelectric interactions. Now, if I get such a high energy beam, then my wavelength will be so small that it'll be even less likely to interact with those inner shell electrons, and therefore I'll have increased penetrability. So high KVP increases beam energy, makes it not necessarily a faster beam because we know that it's traveling at the speed of light, but a higher energy, more transmittable beam, so that we're going to have more penetration, less absorption. With these high KVP beams, more photons transverse the matter without any sort of interaction because their wavelengths are smaller than even the electrons. The interactions that do occur are more likely to be Compton. Now remember, with our high KVP beams, we have higher KeV photons, and it's going to increase the transmittability or the penetration of that beam. Overall, our photoelectric and our Compton interactions will decrease, but the photoelectric interactions decrease at a much higher rate than our Compton does, and so that's why we pay more attention to our scatter when we have the high KeV beam. Now, if we look on the other end and we say, okay, well, what effect does the matter of the body part or the subject contrast of the body part have to do with it? If we have matter with higher atomic number, meaning something like bone that's made up of atoms with more protons or higher atomic number, we're more likely to have photoelectric interactions. And that's because we have those higher energy levels or those higher binding energies, which are going to require or going to eat up all the energy if a photon were to happen to interact with a K-shell electron. So higher atomic number is going to cause more likelihood of photoelectric interaction. The change in atomic number does not affect the ability of Compton scatter to occur. Okay, now coherent scatter we talk very briefly about because this is the scatter that occurs when we have on this very low end of our spectrum, usually at about 10 keV. Now we'd like to think that we don't produce any beam with photons at 10 keV, but we actually do because we know our photons are created on a spectrum. So it's gonna be this end of our spectrum, these little photons coming out with very low energy. They're gonna come into an atom, and it's going to excite the atom as a whole. Remember, our photoelectric and our Compton, those were actually interacting with electrons because they had the smaller wavelength, higher energy. But these have such a longer wavelength, lower energy, that their wavelength is more matched to the size of an atom than it is to an actual electron. So the incoming photon interacts with an atom, excites it for a moment, changes the direction of the incoming photon, but that photon does not lose any energy. So this can occur in X-ray energies, but does not commonly contribute to the image, and so it's not something that we spend a lot of time focusing on. Okay, pair production and photodisintegration, these are two things that we are not going to be concerned with in the energies that we produce in general radiography. So pair production is when we have such a high energy beam that that incident photon, it really has about 1.02 mega electron volts, which we know would be absolutely impossible to create under normal radiographic conditions. That very high energy photon comes close enough to the nucleus that the photon disappears into the nucleus and it creates two electrons, a positron and an electron. So this is, if we talked about the neutron last week, we said that really a neutron, it has weight, but it doesn't really have charge. Well, technically it has a positive and a negative charge that kind of cancels each other, excuse me, cancels each other out, making it neutral. Now, when we have pair production, that energy comes so close, gets absorbed into the nucleus, causing that neutron to eject a positron and an electron, and your neutron then would be annihilated. Now, that positron, or the positive charge, unites with a free electron and results in annihilation. They basically destroy each other, whereas the electron can go out and it can settle into just a vacancy of any other atom that's missing an electron. Now, photodisintegration occurs at even higher, 10 mega electron volts, and in this case, the electron is absorbed in the nucleus, exciting it so much that it releases a nucleon or a nuclear fragment. And again, that's so high that we would never see that with our general radiography techniques, but you have to be aware of these. All right, back to differential absorption. So we know that our body is made of different structures that contributes to our subject contrast. Now, we talked about how that subject contrast is going to affect attenuation versus transmission versus scatter in the body. Scatter ultimately contributes to fog or patient dose, and we say that scatter really doesn't contribute any useful information to an image. There's a slight caveat to that, though, because we talk about when we practice really good scatter reduction techniques like collimation and things like that, that we end up having to adjust our technique to accommodate for that. So we know that while scatter is fog, it's patient dose, it's not really useful information, we still rely on it to get a little bit of the density that we are looking for in our images. So just be aware that while we don't love scatter, when we get rid of it, when we get rid of too much of it, we have to accommodate via our techniques. Okay, photoelectric interactions, that is going to contribute to the patient dose because that energy of that photon is fully absorbed in the patient. And then if that energy of the photon is absorbed in the patient, is not transmitted at all, it does not contribute to the image. However, its brightness or the lack of information is information that we need. It shows us where bone was. It shows us where there was a high attenuating object. Energies above the diagnostic range, like we're talking about with pair production or photodisintegration, those are going to be considered in applications like radiation therapy or other sort of high energy studies, but again, not in general radiography. Okay, other factors affecting beam attenuation. Obviously, if we have thicker tissue, we have more probability that there is going to be an interaction between a photon and an atom, electron, or molecule. So X-rays are attenuated exponentially and generally reduced for about 50% by each 4 to 5 centimeters, or let's say 2 inches. So every increase in every additional inch to 2 inches of thickness, we would therefore have to increase our mass 2 times to accommodate for those changes. Now, the type of tissue is also going to affect our attenuation. As we just spoke about, higher atomic numbers mean more particles, more photoelectric interactions, and then just more electrons in the tissue, which would indicate a higher probability of interactions. And for example, bone, if we averaged all of the atoms that make up bone tissue, it has an effective atomic number of about 13.8. Whereas if we averaged all of the atoms that make up the cells of soft tissue, and we average those, it would have an effective atomic number of 7.4. And when we talk about the effective atomic number, it's really just a description that because bone has so many different atoms making up a bone cell, we can't just assume it's one atom that's going to be interacting. So when we average across all of those, it's going to overall act like the tissue as a whole has an atomic number of 13.8. Tissue density, obviously the denser our tissue, the more compact the atomic particles will be, and the higher the probability of an interaction with those particles. And then our X-ray beam quality. We know that as we increase quality, we're increasing the energy of our photons, decreasing their wavelength, increasing the frequency, and the higher energy, higher frequency beams are going to be a lot less likely to even interact with any atoms at all, which would increase penetration. Okay, and then here's just a brief little chart that kind of outlines exactly what affects photoelectric versus Compton versus transmitted. So higher atomic number is going to increase our photoelectric interactions, decrease our transmission of X-rays, but will not affect our Compton. Higher KVP will increase our photoelectric interactions to a certain level. Now, only to the point that KVP creates a beam with a KeV high enough to eject K-shell electrons. Once it's higher than necessary to eject K-shell electrons, then it's going to just increase our transmission. Compton scatter is relatively increased. Now, it's not overall, if we have a really high KVP beam, remember that increases transmittability, which would overall decrease Compton. However, it's going to decrease it at a much lower rate than it would for our photoelectric interactions. And that higher KVP is ultimately going to increase transmission or penetrability. And then higher mass density. So this is just how compact the cells or the atoms of the body part are. If I have a high mass density, I have more photoelectric interactions, more Compton scatter, and less transmission, because those increased numbers of atoms are going to cause an increased probability that a photon's going to run into something. Contrast exams. So we know that when we want to complete a contrast exam, in this example you see a barium enema on the left and you see an upper GI on the right. We know that barium is a really good positive contrast, and that's because it has an atomic number of 56. So it has a high binding energy, and because of that high binding energy, it's going to absorb a lot of our photons. Now, another type of contrast that we can use is iodinated contrast or iodine contrast. This is more what we use in CT or other applications. It still has a pretty high binding energy because it has that atomic number of 53. So they're pretty close there. And you might want to memorize those. Barium's 56, iodine's 53. And so both have a high mass density as well as that high atomic number. So the probability of the interactions is going to go up. Therefore, if you want to get any penetration when you're using contrast, you have to use over 90 kVp. Now, that doesn't mean you're going to penetrate the thickest areas of the contrast, like say here in the fundus of our stomach, there's a bunch of contrast collected. That center of the contrast, you're never going to penetrate that. But what we do see penetrating is the rugae here. So where there's less contrast, or there's the positive contrast mixed with some air, a negative contrast, you can actually penetrate that. If you were to go less than 90, you would have full absorption through the rest of the stomach. You wouldn't have enough penetration. Same thing over here with our BE study, and you can't necessarily appreciate it that well, but you can see anywhere that there's air, we're able to penetrate here, and we're able to penetrate kind of like at the periphery of the anatomy, but you'll never get penetration through the atomic, through the center of the anatomy, because the thickness of the barium is greater at that point. So always remember, if you're using contrast, you've got to stay above 90 kVp. All right, and then tissue thickness, this just really relates to probability. If I have more tissue, there's more probability that I'm going to have some photon interactions. Less tissue, less probability that I'm going to have those interactions. Type of tissue, we know that bone has the highest atomic number, fat has slightly less, air has even less. We also know that our tissues in our bone are much more compact, so we have a greater mass density in bone. Secondary would be fat, and third would be air. And so therefore, our bone has the greatest attenuation. Fat would be second here, and air would be third. And that comes down to our subject contrast. Okay, X-ray beam quality. We know that the lower energy of the beam, the more it's going to be attenuated in our patient. The higher energy of the beam, the more it's going to penetrate or transmit through that patient. And here's just a quick chart kind of breaking that down for you. Okay, exit radiation or the remnant beam, this is what we're counting on. We need this. If we don't get this, we don't get an image. So this is what's transmitted through our patient. So exit or remnant beam is composed of transmitted and scattered radiation only. Photoelectric interactions are lost inside the body. We don't get information, but the lack of information contributes to information on our image, meaning that absorption creates a brightness on our image, which tells us there was a high absorbing material in that area. The varying amount of transmitted and absorbed radiation create an image that structurally represents the anatomic area of interest or the subject contrast within the body. Scatter radiation reaching the image receptor really contributes to fog. We really don't like fog, and yet we're somewhat reliant on it because when we overcollimate, we see that reduction causes us to have to increase our technical factors to replace that density. Okay, absorbed radiation or photoelectric interactions create a brightness. Transmitted radiation creates a blackness. Various shades of gray can represent some transmission, and they can also represent some scatter. When we look at this image, we would say that our bone here is radio opaque. It has an increased brightness. Our pelvis here is radio opaque in areas. It's got an increased brightness, but it's more radiolucent than our lumbar spine. And that's because the thickness of this ala here is going to be thinner than the thickness of the spine, and that's why you see greater attenuation in the spine than in the ala. So increased brightness here, increased density here. We can also refer to that increased density as a decreased brightness. So as we transfer more into digital imaging, you don't hear people using density as much. You'll hear them calling what's dense a decrease in brightness. We can also refer to those with terminology like radiolucent. This air in the rectum here is radiolucent, whereas this bone in the spine here is radio opaque. We know that less than 5% of the X-ray beam interacting with the body even reaches the image receptor, and even less creates an image. So it's kind of mind-blowing if we go back to how inefficient our processes are. First of all, we had very little of our filament side of the current or tube even contributing to our tube current. Only 1% of those electrons that were in our tube current ever go on to become photons. Of the photons that are produced, only 5% that interact with the body will ever reach the image receptor. And part of those that do reach the image receptor are going to go right through that image receptor, not be attenuated within the image receptor, and therefore not contribute to the beam. Every time we have one of those losses of energy, it's going to cause us to have to increase our techniques, which is going to increase the patient dose. Okay, so when we ultimately get our image, our X-rays are going to, we talked about we're going to have transmission of our X-ray beam. Could be scatter, could be transmitted. And we know that we have a couple different options that's going to happen depending on the system that we're utilizing on our image receptor end. So despite our image receptor type, the X-ray production is always going to be the same. But when we get to those image receptors, that's where we're going to see the change. So if I have a scintillating screen, this would be our old X-ray images. So our old film screen images. And so those photons would come in, they would interact with the screen would produce a brightness, and then that bright light would expose the film. Then we move to CR, where our X-rays come in and they create that interaction, moving our electrons in the imaging plate to a metastable state. And then when those electrons are released from the metastable state in the CR reader, that light will be picked up through our fiber optic cables, taken to a photo detector, and then transmitted through an analog to digital converter, which would then go back to our image processing. So then thirdly, if we have a direct DR, we know that our photons come in, they interact with the amorphous selenium. That amorphous selenium is attracted to our TFT, and it causes a charge to reach the TFT, be stored in the capacitor, and then go out as an electrical signal. So all of these components of the image production is going to be dependent on which system you're using, and we'll review that again before the end of the semester. Now, radiographic quality, this is the quality, the spatial resolution, how appropriately your image represents the actual anatomy. So we know that one of the ways that we can affect our radiographic quality is by providing appropriate brightness and contrast. Another way is by making sure that we have good spatial resolution with limited distortion. So we know that our brightness and our contrast are really going to be dependent upon the beam that we provide. So our KVP, our mass, and how well we correlate that beam to the anatomic structures that are there. So we need to make our beam the optimal technical factors in order to provide the optimal brightness and contrast so that we can visualize the anatomy as best as we can to our ability. The accuracy of structural lines or sharpness, like I said, is really our spatial resolution, or sometimes called recorded detail, and that is going to be most reliant on our geometric factors like we see above here. Now, radiographic quality has, like we just talked about, a couple different components where our brightness and our contrast contribute, as well as our spatial resolution and hopefully lack of distortion. But we can't see our sharpness unless we have good visibility. So if you have a lot of quantum model, if you have too much fog or scatter, then you're never going to be able to see the sharpness. Okay, so our radiographic quality, the visibility part, the brightness of the image, it is going to allow the visibility of the sharpness, but it's not going to determine the sharpness or the resolution. That is only determined by the geometric properties. Okay, image brightness, like we talked about. The digital image is evaluated by brightness through luminance. Luminance is the light emission from the display monitor. And we're going to look more in depth at our display monitors, but basically display monitors are usually backlit. So if I had no image or no image on my display monitor, you would just see a bright white screen. What the image does is it provides blacknesses over that bright white screen, and it covers a lot of those brightnesses. So my unexposed image would have full luminance or full light emission of the display monitor. But when I provide those densities over that, it reduces the luminance. And so the brightness of our digital displays, or even our image brightness, is determined by the luminance or the brightness of that light coming out from behind the backlit display. A film image is evaluated on density. So old school film image, we would only refer to density. With our DR, CR systems, anything computerized, we're referring to it more as brightness. But we almost have to discuss density just to kind of describe how we're getting to those specific brightnesses. And so here you see a hand giving you the thumbs up. Back here, we have what we would call density back in the film screen days. Now somebody might refer to this as low brightness, where this bone, where it's thicker bone here and the knuckles, we would call this higher brightness or higher luminescence. And then we can always refer to this as in comparative terms. This has more luminescence, more brightness. This has less brightness. This is more radio opaque. This is more radiolucent. I'm bright, we're dense. So density, again, refers more to film screen. However, we see him being bright, but he still has a dense background or a lack of brightness. Okay, now we know that we're always trying to get the perfect balance between brightness and density. So here's a knee that most would say that this has excessive brightness. There's not enough densities on here to cover up that brightness, and therefore it would be an underexposed image. Here's a knee where we have so many densities it's covering up the brightness too much. This would be insufficient brightness. Okay, contrast. So the radiograph must exhibit differences in brightness levels or densities, and we call those differences in densities our grayscale. And this contributes to our image contrast. Our image contrast is going to be dependent on the subject contrast, the beam that we use, and how much fog or scatter we have. A range of brightness levels is a result of the tissue's differential absorption of the X-ray photons as well as the spectrum of the X-ray photons we've produced. So the image contrast is really determined by a combination of subject contrast in the body, radiation quality or energy, image receptor and how the number of grays it's able to represent, as well as the computer processing and display. And that comes down to, when we talk about the computer processing and the display, it really comes down to bit depth, right? How many options does it give us for signal? So on the left, we see an image of, I believe, a textbook. It has sufficient brightness, but there's no difference or no contrast across the book. Now on the right, we see a clavicle on top of that book, a couple other things, maybe a notepad and some other little testing device. And you can see that this has more shades of gray. So this, you would say, has a longer scale of contrast, whereas on the left, it has a shorter scale of contrast. We're completely reliant on a patient's subject contrast in order to give us, allow us to see different anatomy within the image. So subject contrast, like we talked about, is going to depend on how the thickness of the part, the density of the atoms, and the atomic number or effective atomic number of the tissue. So in this, on the chest, you see that it has naturally has a high level of contrast, because it has those aerated lungs. Air has very little mass density and it has low atomic number, whereas the spine has a much higher mass density. It's got a higher atomic number, so it's going to absorb more. So naturally, this patient has subject contrast, a change in attenuation factors between different tissues. Here in this abdomen, this is a much lower range of contrast because the atomic number, the tissue thickness, and the density of the tissues are all going to be much more similar, and therefore they're going to attenuate much more similarly. So this would have a lower subject contrast. Our ability to distinguish among types of tissues is determined by the differences in brightness levels of the image or contrast. If we have enough grays, we're able to differentiate very small attenuation differences on our image. So that would allow us to make out this psoas muscle right here and differentiate that from, say, the liver over here. Now, if I didn't have enough shades of gray to demonstrate that, I would not be able to see that differentiation. Therefore, I would have low contrast resolution. Now, if I can see those two things separately because I have lots of grays to demonstrate very subtle changes, then that would mean I have higher contrast resolution. I'm going to need higher contrast resolution on lower subject anatomy than I would on higher subject anatomy. In this case, my anatomy is showing me the differences itself. In this case, I need a very sensitive long-range system that is going to be able to demonstrate these small changes. And that's where we come into contrast resolution, which can be a challenge at sometimes, but I think you guys have it down pretty well. So we have, if I have a very high contrast object, I have blacks and whites. That would be high contrast, but because it wouldn't be good at making out very subtle attenuation differences, it would be low contrast resolution. So contrast resolution and contrast are inversely proportional. If I have a long grayscale, I am able to utilize those slight differences in the grays to represent slight differences in attenuation. So long grayscale would be low contrast, but would offer me to have higher contrast resolution, which the definition of is that's the ability of the system to differentiate between objects with similar subject contrast. So here we see a short scale contrast. Works perfectly for the hand because my hand has high subject contrast. It doesn't need a lot of grays to show subtle differences because the differences in our subject contrast are so high. So short grayscale, high contrast, low contrast resolution. Here we have a longer grayscale. Here's an abdomen. Our abdomen is going to attenuate much more similarly. So I'm going to need those additional grays to differentiate very subtle changes of attenuation within the body. So this would be long scale contrast, low contrast, high contrast resolution. That brings us to spatial resolution, which we've talked about. And spatial resolution is the atomic details or the recorded details. It's the ability to accurately represent what exists in the body on the image receptor. Now, we can talk about subject frequency. Subject frequency, kind of like subject contrast, exists within the body. If I have two very, very small, closely spaced items, let's say, for example, a coronary artery disease would be calcifications sometimes within the very tiny coronary arteries. Those calcifications would be spaced, they would be very small and they'd be spaced very closely together. I would say that those calcifications had high subject frequency. If I had two very large items spaced farther apart, that would have low subject frequency. So let's say my left kidney and my right kidney, those would have low subject frequency because they're spaced they're large and they're spaced far apart. So they would be more similar to these big lines spaced farther apart, whereas those calcifications I discussed would be much smaller and spaced closer together. Well, our spatial resolution refers to the ability of your system to demonstrate how well it can demonstrate those small, closely spaced items. It's easy to demonstrate large items spaced farther apart, harder to demonstrate subject frequency that's very high or small items placed close together. So our ultimate goal is always to have the best spatial resolution, which would be the best spatial frequency. All images are going to have some degree of unsharpness simply because as my beam transmits through the patient, it is going to continue to diverge as it goes to reach the image. So right there in that divergence alone means we're never going to have the perfect image. So there's always going to be some lack of resolution. But the degree of that unsharpness is going to be detected in our spatial resolution. The better the resolution, the higher what we call the modulator transfer function. So anytime you see MTF or modulator transfer function, remember that that is better spatial resolution. Now this will always be under 1. 1 would mean that it has perfect spatial resolution, which we know is impossible. So our MTF will never be 1, but the closer it is to 1 means the better our spatial resolution is going to be. Okay, with distortion, anytime we have an angulation of our beam, an angulation of the part, or an angulation of the IR, we are going to have distortion for shortening and elongating. And so we've talked about this quite a bit in our image analysis class, and we know that in order to limit distortion, we want to have the greatest SID because that will cause the most limited divergence of the beam. We also want to have a minimal OID because that will, again, limit the divergence of the beam between the patient and the image receptor. And anytime we allow that divergence, we are distorting our anatomic part. We also want to make sure that we're keeping our beam perpendicular to our anatomy and our anatomy parallel with the image receptor. Anytime those things are askew, we're going to have distortion. So we can refer to distortion as elongation and foreshortening. And you can definitely see this is a humerus here, and we're seeing it in 3 different ways. We're seeing it with limited minimal distortion in A, foreshortened in B, elongated in C. And that would all have to do with either angulation of the beam, the part, or the image receptor. And here's some good examples of exactly how. Here's where we have a greater OID, and you see that the distortion is in the size. It's going to, because it's equal across the whole anatomy, that distortion is going to cause a size change in the image. And here you see as the OID increases even more, you get even more significant size. Here's where we're angling the body part. Our central ray is good, our image receptor is good, but our body part is angled, and you see how you're going to foreshorten one end and elongate the other. And then here we have a good beam, we have a good anatomic position, but we have an angled image receptor, and again, it's going to foreshorten one and elongate the other. Okay, scatter, we talk about this pretty extensively. Scatter is any unwanted exposure resulting in fog on our image. So you can see the image on the left has extreme scatter to where we can't even visualize the anatomy. It doesn't matter what kind of spatial resolution we have here, that scatter is covering it up. The scatter is not affecting our spatial resolution, it's simply covering it up. We know that this is a result of Compton interactions. We know some of the things that affect the probability of Compton interactions is going to be part thickness and the amount of tissue that's being exposed, as well as the energy of our beam. So this might be something that we needed to decrease our KVP, but probably most importantly, we would need to collimate more to try and decrease the mass of tissue that's being irradiated. It provides no useful information, it decreases image contrast, and it decreases our ability to see structures. Doesn't mean the recorded detail is not there or the spatial resolution, it just means we can't see it because it's covered up. Okay, quantum noise, as you know, we could call this quantum model. This is visible as brightness or density fluctuations. This is caused by low levels of mass or inadequate levels of mass. And so we are simply not getting enough data on the image receptor to provide our resolution. This is when we talked about the example of maybe spray painting our globe. And if we just gave it 1 squirt of spray paint, we wouldn't be able to see the outline at all. But if that's because of a lack of information. But as we add more and more spray paint, you can make out that lines much more clearly. So there's no way to correct quantum noise or quantum model except for re-exposure with higher numbers or a higher MA. All right, image artifacts, we talked about this. This can really skew your histogram. So here's a patient left their necklace on. This will really cause a lot more brights on that raw data histogram. That needs to be removed. And that's just really pretty much all there is to it. Not only is it covering up anatomy, it demonstrates a laziness on the technologist's part, but also is going to affect your EI value. Okay, limitations of film screen imaging. So we know that we don't really worry too much about film screen imaging anymore, but some of the ways that that DR has overtaken film screen. We know that actually with film screen, it has better spatial resolution than DR systems. But because it has a limited dynamic range, meaning it only has a certain number of intensities, it doesn't have as long a grayscale, it will never have as good of contrast resolution as our CR and DR systems. So because of that, they've really found that improvement in contrast resolution really overrides the lack of spatial resolution. With film screen, there's also high cost to film, the need for storage, the need for chemicals, the upkeep of your processing systems. All of those come at a high cost and take a lot of time. We also know that what you get when you take a film screen image. It is what it is. There's no post-processing. You can't correct for any subtle deviances from technique or anything like that. It is what it is, so it's going to result in a lot more repeat rates. They also cannot be stored electronically, resulting in these huge film archives that can take up rooms and rooms and rooms in an institution. And therefore, that's why we've really made the conversion from film screen to DRs. Dynamic imaging really refers to fluoroscopy. Dynamic means motion or changing. So fluoroscopy is basically utilizing photons or X-ray imaging to produce live images over time. This is done in a couple different ways, and so we'll get into that more in the next couple weeks. And there's more of the traditional end that utilized more common practices of taking multiple live or a continuous live image. Now it's transitioning a little bit more to taking very closely spaced digital images. So we're going to be discussing that in upcoming weeks. And in summary, I'll let you read through that, and I will let you all be on your way with this nice little review under your belt. Have a great day.